So usually I always kind of talk about different type of awarenesses, and I think that I don't want to stress so much about awareness and more so, and I want to focus more on actual recovery practices and just things to do in result of those things. I think it can be very heavy when we're talking about all of the things to kind of look for. When I kind of was looking online about recovery things from like CPTSD or different type of abuse or harassment and things of that nature, I wasn't finding a lot of information. I was seeing a lot of people kind of just relaying. I seen more of people kind of just crowding of their experiences and personal experiences, which I think is very which is a part of kind of recovery, especially when it comes to people trying to kind of heal from things. You kind of verbalize a lot of times, and that's kind of us building community. That was an era online where people were kind of flooding their experiences to find people who were kind of like themselves, to kind of let them know that they weren't alone, for one, and for two, that they weren't delusional in their experience, that they were actually that what they were experiencing was abnormal, as far as this is not right and fair. Right? You don't see many recovery. Like when I was looking online, I was kind of looking for that recently. I was looking for a lot of different type of references in that manner, and you don't see that a lot of times. You only see like a reoccurring of the experience, you know. And I would say that I feel like I'm in a typically sound mind. And when I say sound mind, I should say there was a time when I was very disturbed and I couldn't find like peace. I couldn't find time where I felt comfortable enough to kind of just be, and I'm not in that space no more. And so speaking from in a space where I feel more comfortable just being in space is just engaging with people, not feeling like I have to kind of share my story, not feeling like I have to kind of, you know, give what do they say that? Give a disclaimer like, oh, hey, I've dealt with this. I mean, getting over that space, you don't really see, I don't see people talking about that a lot. I actually don't see it, actually. So apparently iPhone got perfect mics because it's like canceling out the background noise, but it's kind of loud in here. I'm surprised that I'm being heard so clear. So when it comes to like situations where you have to recover from experiences that kind of change your state of being or state of condition, it's very important that you recognize that the way that the world is going to receive you and respond to you is not going to be the same as before, right? Not only that, but the type of behaviors or engagements that you had to engage in before they won't be executed the same way, I should say. If that makes sense. So a big part of recovery, you know, is not just about reframing your mind. It's about completely creating a new civilization for yourself, a new function, behavior, thought process, engagement, all those things. Because typically, those experiences alters how you even perceive the world in general, right? So experiences before that, even if it's not as far as the world not receiving you properly, you're not even going to receive the world in the same way, right? So today, we're going to speak on something kind of minimal, such as like bullying, and just talk about processes of reconditioning, re-civilizing, and how to kind of operate around those type of dynamics and handling it. It's important to kind of to truly equip yourself and practice empathy when you are kind of addressing and trying to kind of break down behaviors, right? And this isn't because it makes you more empathetic, it makes you more susceptible and like, oh, I feel for you, let me lay down and be nice to you because you're harming me. No, it gives you the proper tools to truly neutralize. You understand? When you are using the proper tools, the proper correlations to behaviors, you can actually accurately neutralize it. What should I say? It makes your civil equipment, I should say, more effective. Today we're going to talk about picking on someone versus bullying, right? So picking on someone, I would say, is just making light about something vulnerable. So picking on someone versus bullying, let's kind of talk about this kind of topic, right? So picking on someone, I would say, is just making a joke or making light about something that's vulnerable, right? You're just picking on them, right? It's not always too bad. It just is what it is, right? Bullying, when it gets to that extent, is the moment when we make a ritual of making jokes or light about something vulnerable or ignoring a person's boundaries to stop, right? Not only are you hurting the individual, right, but you are overriding their means or defense to protect themselves. You understand? So that's kind of the difference between just making light and making fun versus bullying. You understand? Now, repetitive impact on a weak spot is intended to toughen people up rather break them down. Let's start there. This is the sentiment behind most bullying. Let's start there. If you break down, that's a testament to your lack of readiness for the cruelties and harsh realities of the world, right? The problem with that sentiment is that typically those who break down from being picked on are typically already victims of the harsh realities of life, right? I.e. poverty, marginalization, or abuse. You understand?
Yeah.
So their resilience isn't the issue, rather the lack of respect for boundaries. So they're going to start there. So typically they're the first stage where a person lays boundaries as to their treatment or what they will tolerate, right? Then when it gets to the next stage, typically is when excuse me. Right. So typically, the first stage is someone laying boundaries about what they will and won't tolerate, right? That's usually kind of what signifies that happening. If it ends, it's typically not that serious. It goes away. But in some cases where that's not respected, those boundaries aren't respected, and people continue, they usually do so in a manner that is to kind of change the common functions of a space as to victimize or make a person vulnerable and override those boundaries. It isn't as direct because now once a person verbalizes, which I should say, we're going to talk about boundaries today, right? Once a person verbalizes that they don't like a certain behavior or something, and it's a common civil function that we all understand that you need to stop. You understand? So the engagement turns from just overt to more, I should say, the shift of the environment or the space or the functions of the space, right? As to override it, so it's not as overt of me just overriding boundaries, right? So, I think that a root to bullying is not just to name all forms of non-acceptable behaviors and to raise awareness, but it's rather to raise a culture of respecting boundaries and teaching how to equip, construct, and identify boundaries. That's very important, right? So, let me move this notebook. The reason why this is important, right, is because boundaries are different relative to your condition, right? So you can't have generalized boundaries. That's very important. The way that you engage with boundaries or the type of boundary that you're going to have to construct or equip is relative to your psyche, your mental processing, your disability, or your orientation, your space. You understand? Like I said, poverty, marginalization, your condition, circumstances changes what boundaries you're going to have to in place in order to keep yourself safe. So it's very important that we teach people, right, not just to have boundaries and that about boundaries, but how to construct them accommodated to their circumstance and their condition, as well as how to equip them, right? Not just how to construct them and have them, but how to actually equip them and utilize them for their protection. Next is also how to identify them in other people and recognize them, because they look differently, right? Boundaries are differently for different people. Now, this is important to talk about because I find while some people don't follow rules just in rebellion of having authority beyond themselves, many, including myself, right, don't follow what doesn't make sense, right? And that's just in a basic term. We're not getting too extreme, right? Or is accessible to their benefit, which is another important point, right? Not only do they not follow things that don't make sense, but if it's not accessible to my benefit, meaning that I can't equip the rules for my own protection or my own rights, typically, an individual won't be as apt to kind of abide or respect, right? For example, let's say a child picks on a kid at school, right? The kid doesn't resort to fighting, but simply asserts their boundaries. They don't want to play that way, right? Let's say the kid who was picking either continues to pick to provoke a fight or because they think the individual is too sensitive or entitled to civil engagement. Now, that's not the words they would use, but you get the picture. They feel that they may need to toughen up or get over it or deal with it. You understand? Now, let's talk about roots of these two examples, right? Both of those responses typically come from someone who can't or couldn't equip the same boundaries of protection for themselves, right? So what I find is when you make law or boundaries more accessible and inclusive and to conditions or circumstances, you get more abidance and allegiance. You understand? For example, let's say in the scenario where the child continues the bullying, right? An adult competent in conflict resolution, rather dehumanizing the child as if humans are born morally perfect, unneeding for civil morale to be constructed or developed, in recognition of how morale can be regressed of bad conditioning and skilled in applicable morale conditioning, right? That's the individual that we're talking about. Let's say that adult recognizes the lack of respect for boundaries in the child, right? As what it is rather than all those other things that I just named, right? And they connect to the child, of course, after first separating the target child. Let's say they connect to the child, the adult connects to the child, and the child reveals areas in which boundaries or the same boundaries haven't or don't protect them or are accessible to them for their protection, right? And of course, they may not say it in that way directly. It's more for your way to kind of pick up on it, right? So let's say empathy and advocacy for their boundaries, or a boundary construction, equiption, and identification has proceeded next, was this next operation, right? So once this discovery of the lack of boundaries in the child's life, being correlated to the lack of respect in a way, and we in place it, the adult in places it with boundary construction operations, right? Equiption, teaching them how to equip them, identifying what's the next operation proceeded, right? And these were accommodated to their experiences and conditions, right? Not just generalizing like these are the rules. Typically really getting ingrained with the child's life to kind of construct boundaries relative to their actual conditions and how they can equip them and how they will be accessible to them, right? Because everybody can't equip boundaries in the same way or have them accessible to themselves, right? Depending on not just with circumstances externally, but internally as well. This teaches them that in the real world, right, it's possible to come together in community to defend civil rights. You understand? Rather resort to regressive civility and treat civilization, right? In this context, I mean the organization of human rights when I'm speaking of civilization, right? Rather than resort to regressive civility and treat civilization as a fickle or fetish of the defenseless, right? Which is kind of aligned with what I was talking about originally. It aligns with me saying of people feeling that people are entitled to kind of civil engagement and things of that nature, right? Not understanding that that's what a civilization is, the organization of human rights. I do feel people are so entitled to civil engagement. I do feel that some people are, right? That is a thing, right? That they forget we aren't born this way. We have to be conditioned into civility relative to our past circumstances and not just the standards of society. Now that's where I feel that people get too entitled to civil engagement, right? Of assuming, of feeling like they can dehumanize people when they don't adhere or aren't morphed to those as if they came out, as if they weren't morphed from that, right? Not taking into account that civilization gave those conditions to be the standard of safety or to even get them receptive to the applications of civility, which is an entirely different thing, right? I talk about that, I think, next. Oh, yeah, I talk about that next, right? So boom. It's not just about being aware of civilization and civil engagement, but you have to actually be receptive to the application, which is an entirely different conditioning, right? So now, beyond that, trauma can prohibit the production of practical civil processing, meaning processing with the security that there are options beyond fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, as well as not being at the mercy or suffering of your impulses and instincts, which is another thing of regressive civility, right? When I think about people before civilization who were operating in fight, flight, or fawn, when we talk about regressibility, people only talk about the responses to danger. They never just talk about the regular engagements of how people were actually satiating their impulses and instincts, right? And when we speak about that in that manner, it allows us to understand how civilization morphs that, and it doesn't, I should say, it allows people to stop dehumanizing when we have traumatized or corrupted conditions of instincts and impulses, right? Of understanding that there's a lack of conditioning, you understand? Or a faulty one, or even trauma prohibiting for the correction of a conditioning. So I want to focus on another part of the hypothetical. The civilization of the adult equipped them with the conditioning to develop a conscience in the child, as well as equipping the child in defense and correction of their own civil issues in this scenario, right? They advocated for the bullying. They didn't shift the bullying to the humanization of the child, rather found areas in which they were unprotected and armed them with defense, awareness, and advocacy of community, right? Which recovers at-risk individuals, right? So yeah, that's all for today. I didn't give an example of engagement for adults, right? Which is engaged a bit differently, right? When it comes to a child, right, you can have someone kind of speak over you. But when it's an adult, you are going to have to create your own civilization, like I said, re-civilizing yourself relative to your beliefs, your condition, your circumstances, right, and what you're recovering from. It's hard for people who are in recovery to kind of find community with other people who are recovering because we all recover so differently. So I would advise, why I say first it's important to kind of create a civilization, is because then you can commune around the civilization, right? People who are already kind of aware of aligning their conditioning to the function and how you can assist them, how they can assist you, how you all can kind of organize to each other for your own safety, for your own recovery, right? Rather than just kind of rather than trying to organize people according to your healing. You understand? And that's something that a lot of people talk about, is when they're speaking of, there are some times where people are entitled to feel that they can make everybody move according to what happened to them. And so it's very important that you construct a civilization relative to your healing, right? That is not, that for one is civil, right? So that you can actually, it's actually applicable to, for engagements, right? It's reasonable, practical for other people to kind of abide by, you know, relative to your conditioning. It's like if I see somebody with a disability, I naturally will move how I'm engaging, right? Not all the way, of course. Sometimes, you know, depending on the person, they're like, don't treat me differently, but you naturally have to kind of accommodate to that experience. And when you kind of organize a function, a civilization for yourself, which I kind of give certain parameters to like stand by in my class, so that you can make sure that it's civil. Because civil, the word civil, when I say that, I simply means in a manner that is actually reasonable and practical for other people, right? To involve others, to involve, you know, multiple community, right? It's something that's not just centered around you, only for you, regardless of however other people are impacted, right? So that's really all that is. And that's why it's important as an adult you do that, because as a child, people are more apt to kind of move around you because they're the future. But as an adult, you have to take the due diligence to kind of construct a civilization so that you can tell people, this is how I function, or know when and how to even direct people, right? Relative to your well-being, right? Because whether we like it or not, people say it's controlling, whatever. There is a level of influence that we have on each other, and as well as that civil to kind of concede to. Is that the right word? I hope that's the right word, but you know, so that's all.